Anytime you're trying to button up a Linux box, you're like, "Ah, man, there's so many things to do. How would I ever cover all these bases?" Well, let's take a look at some of the common security utilities you can use with Linux.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hey there, everyone, and I know you're excited like I am to dive into the Linux security world, and we're going to be talking about some of those security utilities. And just to start off, I think we need to dive into something that's probably overlooked a great deal: anti-malware and antivirus for Linux systems. We don't have to worry about that at all, right?
Oh, no, never. Hopefully you're catching the giant amount of sarcasm coming from both of us, because you do need to worry about that. Linux also requires you to install antivirus or anti-malware, something that will, protect it from those baddies that are out there. We don't like that. We want to avoid that. And Justin, to your point, it's absolutely correct. There is this idea that because Linux is not Windows, then I don't have to worry about malware. That is what we like. If Maury Povich was here right now, he would say, the lie detector has determined that that is a lie.
And I think that's one of those things where I guess you have to be careful, because I tend to put people who use Linux into a more savvy category.
That's true.
I've had less and less problems with viruses and malware just because of my behaviors. Right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that if you push this across the organization, or maybe you have a specific use case for Linux, that everybody would have those behaviors. So we need to have a padding, kind of a backup plan, right?
Correct. Especially if for whatever reason you're pushing Linux as the operating system for your user base. So if that's happening, again, going to Justin's point, might not be everyone in your user base that has that experience. I can run Windows without AV. It's not a smart idea, but I could probably go for a while without getting hit by something, as long as there's not like some weird O-Day out there hitting me. We run antivirus, regardless of the operating system. You should do that. Now, there's a couple of them you're thinking, okay, well, you've sold me. What antivirus should I run? I'm not going to pretend to tell you what you should run, but I can give you some options. A couple that spring to mind are going to be ClamAV and Sophos. They'll do a fantastic job. Let's jump in, just look at their website. Here's Sophos Antivirus for Linux. I'll kind of zoom in on the URL there. Also, Justin, remind me to put that in our learner resources for these good folks right there. But there you go. If you wanted to pause it, you could see it. Simple download. I would highly recommend that you got right here the documentation, that you would look over that stuff, because sometimes this isn't just as easy as point and click, double click this and it's installed. It can require some configuration, especially when you're working with Linux. So they love that kind of stuff. But there you go. That's Sophos. Here's ClamAV, right? Great stuff. Telling you it's a standard, high performance, versatile, and open source. Oh, don't.
I tell you what, there's very few times someone catches me with a logo. They're one of them. I like that logo. For some reason,
logo,
I'm like, install that. I don't even need it, but I just install it.
Like, I got Sophos already, but I throw Clam on top of it.
Yeah, that's right. Just layer it on.
That's some good antivirus.
Yeah,
But there you go. Now you got a couple of options, and I'm sure if you did a Google search, you'll find some other. These are very commonly used antivirus, anti-malware solutions for Linux systems. So that's why I bring them up, make them aware if you were to see something that might be on one of these two or others. But there you go. Antivirus, anti-malware, very important.
Now, Daniel, I know you and I have run Linux as our daily driver before. I still use Linux on my personal computer. I run a Mac right now just for the job that we do. I've worked in other locations, government installations, where Linux is the default one. And they have some very privy information, some private that they want to keep track of. So I'm guessing we need to talk about intrusion detection systems that work inside the Linux ecosystem, right?
Yeah, totally. IDSs and IPSs are, again, very important pieces of the puzzle when it comes to security. And it's just not Linux, right? We see this in Windows as well. We see it in Mac as well. We're just focusing on Linux today. And we're kind of walking our way through these major areas that could be used to be leveraged for compromise. So here we are, we're talking about IDSs, IPSs. What do they do? Remember, an IDS, intrusion detection system, is meant to detect when a specific bad thing is happening and alert the user that that is happening. IPS, on the other hand, says, well, I can go even farther, and if I see these types of things that we are not authorized to see happening, I'm going to just stop it. I'll put the kibosh on it. I have that ability and permission from the end user that has set this up and configure it. When I start thinking about IDS and IPS, I always run straight to Snort. Snort is the de facto standard for these things. Let's go to their site. Let's see if we can't find them. Snort. And if you just do quickly, I will. This is small. There we go. Snort. I know it's an explosive sound made by a sudden forcing of breath through one's nose, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about like snort.org, intrusion detection and prevention systems. So if you check this, like I said, de facto standard, I highly recommend kind of perusing their site, learning a little bit more about them. I have it configured right now. I will tell you, it can be a bit of work, right? It's going to take you a minute to understand how everything, especially if you are brand new to doing something like this. So just be prepared for probably a little bit more heavy of a lift than you might be used to with just regular software installation and configuration. But once you get it running, once you get it tuned, you can grab things like they have a community list. I think probably if you go to downloads up here in the corner, let's take a look. It's probably under additional rules. Let's try rules. There we go.
That site is horribly inaccessible.
Yeah, it is pretty bad, right? But here's where you can get the community rules right there. Version 3.0, version 2.9. You're going to get different rules inside of those things. But they're basically community shared rules. You don't have to just sit there and try to reinvent the wheel. You can also grab the rules there, slap them into your Snort installation, point to them and say, hey, use these rules. And now you got a really good base of things. And of course you can go in and add or delete anything that's just not applicable to your configuration. But it is a really good way to start off with a base. So you grab the package, get it installed, grab those rules, get them put into place, work the configuration file, let it know to look for those rules, and you should be really good to go. I do like Snort because it is very effective. But if you're uninitiated in this, doing stuff like this, it can be a bit of a bear to get configured. So just be prepared for that. Another one will be Suricata. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Let's do a search for that here. Suricata, right? So Suricata. And you'll see it is an open source IDS, IPS, and NSM. Another horrible website. Don't judge them by their website, folks. It's not their fault. They work on this
They
product.
know not what they do.
You're right. This product is what you should really judge them by, which is great. But as you can see, it's free and open source, mature, fast, robust. We like that. Also does network security monitoring and offline PCAP processing. It's kind of sweet. So here's a look at their dashboard, kind of giving you some of the ideas of things you'll see as you get logged into that. Again, it's probably a bit of a configuration bear, but it does a really good job as well. So these are the two big dogs that I run to when I start talking IDSs and IPSs inside of the Linux world. So be aware of those.
And both of those, I did see it there for Suricata, but just for Snort, both of those a lot of times will interface with things like Logstash and Kibana, like you're using something, or other SIEM type things where you're ingesting logs and looking as well.
Totally. Yeah, actually, Snort is the basis for a lot of those types of systems. It's kind of running under the hood. Cisco Firepower, I think, is running Snort.
Oh, gotcha.
So you'll see it in a lot of weird places, and because it's open source and stuff, so you can just like, oh, I'll just use that and build something off of it, which is done very effectively. And since it's got a good community behind it, you again see that maturity and robustness of it. So highly recommend checking those guys out to keep your Linux system secure.
Now, speaking of something that's easy to configure, let's talk about firewalls.
Okay.
I'm joking.
That's called a joke.
Yeah, it's a GIAC. So anytime I see, hey, we need to watch the network, we need to watch our computers, I know in recent years it's got to where I'm like, if I can just keep people from even getting this far, that's going to help me a great deal, because I don't want a lot of traffic in these utilities where I'm like, well, wait a minute, is that legit? Is this bad?
Right.
So this is where firewalls come into play, right?
Yeah, and firewalls are great because just about every Linux installation is probably pre-baked with some sort of firewall, either that be the universal firewall, which is most likely what you're going to encounter, but you can still access it through the IP tables, which was the previous iteration of the UFW. I cut my teeth on IP tables, so that's where I'm more comfortable. But there might be a graphical front end for them. You never know. There's a lot of playing around. I've seen some pretty good headway made in the UFW's graphical. I don't know if Kali has. Let's take a look. Let's do some exploring. Let's see here. Do you have anything? I'll just type in universal firewall. No, it doesn't have a front end for it. But I can take a look in IP tables. If I do an IP tables /L like that, I can see the policies. I can start to manipulate them. If you do a man IP tables, you really get some good information here because you need to understand how these rules are created to do them effectively. But once you get the idea that a firewall is basically a top-down list of rules. If what I'm seeing meets any of these rules, then I stop processing and I employ the rule, right? If not, then I get the default policy, whatever that is, and that's what happens. But basically, we're able to deny, reject, or accept traffic based off of where it came from, right? We're seeing things like, let's get down past these arguments here. But if you see, like which table you're using, which filter, are you natting? Let's see here, some other great options for this. If we want to append the rules, so again, the order in which rules are applied is very important, so you got to be very specific on how that works, and that will take some fine tuning. You can obviously delete rules, insert rules, replace rules, list the rules, which is what we just saw. Then we start getting into parameters. This IPv4, which protocol am I going to be using? We see that right there with just the -P switch. You'll see a lot of this, right? -S, which is saying what kind of source. Is it the source this address, or is it maybe this network? So I can base rules off saying, hey, if I get anything from the 10.10.4 network, or whatever it is, then reject it. Otherwise, accept it, right? That kind of thing going on. You also see these exclamation points to let you know that that's not this. So kind of like the inverse action, if you want to take that. Let's see, destinations, if it matches certain things, and also do connection based, so checking on whether or not this is an established connection, doing some deep packet inspection. IP tables is actually a pretty robust firewalling system. So yes, this is a lot for you to take in, but really, if you spend a day kind of fiddling with it, trying to set up some rules, you'll probably get a pretty good sense of how to make this happen. You might not be able to go, oh, let me just craft a rule quickly, but you would know where to go. You would kind of have an idea of how it's supposed to look and that kind of stuff. So I highly recommend employ the firewall that Linux gives you to defend your system. So check that out. It's good stuff.
I will say, though, if you're working on a remote system that you don't have physical access to,
Warning.
make sure you check your rules before you enable either UFW or IP tables. It's a good way. I've said this in probably 7 other episodes. You will lock yourself out. Yeah. And then, I mean, I'm not talking like you lock, like, oh, I got the key. Like you threw the key down the hall, then you locked the door, and then you deadbolted the door, and then you welded it shut.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just keep that in mind if you're using IP tables or UFW. IP tables it's very robust, it's very powerful. It can get a little confusing, so I would play around on like a throwaway box initially just to get a hang for it. Now,
smart guy.
I try. Well, School of Hard Knocks. So speaking of hard, something that I had trouble with when I first got pushed into this like sysadmin-y kind of role is they were like, oh, you need to make this secure. I go, I don't know what you're saying. I was like, they're like, oh, you need to like harden it up. What? And then I found out about hardening guides, but there's also programs that will help you like with that hardening process, right?
That is correct, that you can actually install onto the machine itself and it'll go, hey, let me help you out with that. So it's like a hardening software. It's I put it on. Now, a lot of times, either your machine comes with nothing, or if you're in Red Hat land, you're probably running into SE Linux. So this would include Red Hat, Fedora, it's CentOS. Yes, thank you. I wanted to say CoreOS. That's not right. CentOS. These flavors of Linux, any kind of Red Hat variant, a lot of times comes with SE Linux. It's a fantastic system for sandboxing your environment and saying, well, we've got this application here. Maybe it's the web application, right? We've got Apache installed. We've got MySQL installed. I want to say, you're only allowed to do this. You're only allowed to talk and manipulate and interface with these areas of the system, right? Let's take a look at their website and see what they say about themselves. SE Linux. Just Googling it here, and it's Security Enhanced Linux, as you can see. There's a Wikipedia page. There we go. SE Linux. And they've got a great wiki. Okay, so I'm going to blow this up here. Again, security stuff tends to be just a big old pain in the backside a lot of times when it comes to configuration. You read a lot of, Don always makes this joke, you read a lot of blog posts about how do I configure SE Linux to allow me to be able to blah, 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 right? And most people will just say, well, just shut off SE Linux. Just disable SE Linux for that because it's really difficult. Yep, it can be really difficult to get all the rules and everything correct. But again, it's one of those things where if you spend some time with it and you learn that like shutting it off it basically might as well uninstall it at that point. It is a security feature that does a really good job of keeping bad guys from, let's say they did get some sort of access. They're not going any farther than that. That's going to do a huge lift on making sure that that is the case. That if someone were to gain unauthorized access, the SE Linux will say, well, you got access to this, but you don't have access to these things over here. Why would that need this? If you get that set up correctly, highly recommend it. Their Wikipedia or their wiki page can help a lot. Read documentation. You're going, I don't want to read documentation. Neither do I. I don't like doing it. It is not fun, but it is beneficial. So I will recommend it to you. And that you know that SE Linux is there and that shutting it off is not the proper way to configure it. So just be aware of that. Another one is Bastille. Bastille was like the big dog on the block before SE Linux kind of took over the world. Let's see here. Bastille, Bastille, I think. I probably need to add Linux on that.
Yeah. You got the Bastille, like French Revolution, the band.
It's going to go a little crazy. But again, wow, websites for Linux are just the best. But there you go. It's going to have all that. Again, using that Bastille hardening program locks down an operating system, proactively configuring the system for increased security and decreasing its susceptibility to compromise. So it's kind of like helping you do all that hardening stuff, but through a program. Hey, do all the standard things. Take a look at my system. Do the standard things that would go to this. And maybe I look through that. Oh, that doesn't apply, or this does apply. I need to enable or disable something. But pretty straightforward. Again, you always want to read the documentation to make sure you're getting the most bang for your buck with these things. But highly recommend it. Great stuff there. So Bastille won't steal it wrong either.
And this would have been really helpful for me. I'm going to have to remember these for any future endeavors. There was a couple of times, though, that I was introduced to an existing running server. They're like, hey, so this server's been up for 2 years. I'm like, I'm sorry? Has it ever had updates? Nope.
Updates are dumb.
Yeah. So I didn't even know where to start, but I was like, oh, I don't know if it's secure or not. There's software for scanning systems like that for vulnerabilities, like existing vulnerabilities, right?
Yeah, I always recommend a vulnerability scanning system of actually quite a few of them as a default thing, so that you can just keep an eye on the system security in general, right? These are things like run Nmap. This is going to be like run a proper vulnerability assessment scanner like Nessus or OpenVAS. Right? They will actually look at the system, probe it for known vulnerabilities, and generate a report. It's got dashboards. Both of them are fantastic. So if you don't have the money for something like Nessus, that OpenVAS will treat you very well. At least it's something you're keeping an eye on. A lot of security comes down to the fact that we just don't look. We don't pay attention. If we were paying attention, we would have seen this. We're being proactive, right? We want to be proactive. If we're not, you're just asking for a compromise. And what do they say? The average time before compromises or breaches realized, it's like 9 months.
Yeah, it was 6 or 9 months, something like that.
You want to drop that down to a much lower number than that. Okay, so these things can help you do that. Check your passwords. Use things like John the Ripper or Hashcat just to run through your Etsy shadow file and see if there's any low-hanging fruit, and then walk over to that user and have some take that as a teachable moment and say, hey, I understand you're not a techie, or if you are, what are you doing? You know better than this. Bad password here. Let's see if we can't fix that, because I just ran a password cracker on this and I was able to disseminate your password. So those things can be super helpful. So knowing what services that you're running with Nmap, looking for known vulnerabilities using things like OpenVAS and Nessus, and of course checking things like password robustness with Hashcat or John the Ripper. Super helpful. I always recommend those as security tools that are just standard on any system.
Well, I tell you what, Daniel, I've got a list of things that I'm now going to use for any future endeavors. I'm always in Linux land with web dev and such like that. So this is going to be helpful to me and hopefully helpful for you. But we got more GSEC coming at you. But for now, we're going to go ahead and get out of here. So signing off for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Justin Dennis.
I'm Daniel Lowry.
And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.